around the world. Empowerment has been at the heart of health and development programs around the world for decades. Many development agencies and charities focus on empowering women and girls as a means to promote gender equality. Many of you have probably heard of the UN's Millennium Development Goals. In 2000, the United Nations released these goals, and these goals guided the work of the United Nations in billions of dollars over the past 20 years. As you can see, there's 8 of them, and the third one includes empowering women. Oxfam, which is one of the world's largest charities and development organizations, also centered women's economic empowerment in their work. And just last year, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is arguably one of the most important funders of global health work today, announced an investment of about $650 million to further the economic empowerment of women. As you can see in their own materials, they say that we believe that when women and girls are empowered to live to their full potential, everyone benefits exponentially. So many people would agree that women's empowerment is important in its own right, but it's also been found to be linked to many beneficial health outcomes, such as increased utilization of healthcare, higher rates of vaccination, and lower rates of maternal and child mortality. So what is empowerment? Empowerment, of course, is a term that many of us have heard and think that we have an intuitive understanding of. And just as we've seen, millions, if not billions of dollars have already been spent on increasing women's empowerment around the world. So before delving deeper into the analysis, it's worth noting that empowerment has actually been measured and defined in many different ways. And therefore, empowerment means a lot of different things to many different people. So these are 3 widely cited conceptualizations of empowerment. The first one here says it's the process by which the powerless gain control over the circumstances of their lives. Other people have described it as what a person is free to do and to achieve in pursuit of whatever goals or values he or she regards as important. And then it's also been described as including greater self-confidence and an inner transformation of one's consciousness that enables one to overcome external barriers. So these definitions all have some things in common, but it's also worth noting that what they don't have in common. So some focus on abilities or capabilities as important components of empowerment. Other people include freedom and thinking like taking account one's own goals and how one's own goals might differ from the status quo and take that into account when thinking about empowerment. And still others focus on inner transformation. So it could include greater self-confidence and some things that happen within women. So it's worth noting that there is not one concise definition of empowerment. And this is probably because empowerment, as it sounds, is a pretty abstract construct. It's been studied in many different fields, which also might lead to different conceptualizations. People have studied empowerment in gender studies, human rights, public health, and many other fields. Now, since empowerment has been so important and a big focus of development work around the world, it's important to understand the factors that might shape empowerment. So this study, as was mentioned earlier, examines how labor migration and remittances shape women's empowerment. So as you all know, migration has become a defining issue of this century. Today, there are over 160 million labor migrants, and meaning that they work outside of their home countries. Labor migrants often send money to their family members and friends and even communities in the form of remittances. And this sending and receiving of remittances is one of the most important ways that migration shapes transnational families. So families who have a migrant abroad or multiple migrants abroad, and then the rest remain in their home or sending countries. And as you can see, an enormous amount of wealth is really transferred during in the form of remittances. On the slide, you can see that in 2018, labor migrants sent nearly $700 billion in remittances. And there's been a vast literature that has focused on the effects of these remittances. A lot of it has focused on the economic effects, and they found that remittances can reduce poverty levels, contribute to economic growth, and they allow households to reduce their budgetary constraints. In many cases, they can act as safety nets or as insurance by providing households with additional money to pay for unexpected emergencies or shocks. And remittances can also influence health in many ways. Another study that I was working on as part of my dissertation was a systematic review that mapped the different pathways through which labor migration and remittances shaped health outcomes. And overall, it found that remittances improved health outcomes, and it did so by allowing households to pay for healthy foods, medical treatment, and housing. There's also been a sociological literature that looks at the effects of remittances, and they found that remittances allow families to maintain transnational relationships. They signal to family members that migrants are finding success because not only are they earning enough money to pay for themselves, but they're also able to remit additional earnings back to their family members. It also signals a commitment from the migrant to their family members because it builds trust and helps them feel connected to each other. This constant sending of money really keeps them connected to each other. And as we'll see in this study, remittances might also profoundly influence aspects of women's empowerment. Some literature has already focused on the relationship between migration and empowerment, and it's found conflicting results. So the labor migration of men has been found to increase women's empowerment by leading the woman to take on more responsibilities. Studies have found that the outmigration of men shapes the gender and power dynamics within the household and gives women responsibilities that men previously had. Other studies actually found the opposite. They found that the outmigration of men limits women's empowerment and leaves them vulnerable to challenges that come with an absent male household head. So although sometimes men are hundreds of miles away, they still remain in control of the household. And in other cases, women become subjected to or under the control of other family members, such as their parents or their in-laws. So this conflicting evidence suggests that more research is needed to understand the complex ways in which migration influences empowerment. And these conflicting results could also be explained by the fact that different people define and measure empowerment in different ways. So studies with more comprehensive empowerment indicators might help make more sense of these patterns. This study has two related research questions. The first is, how does the labor migration of men shape women's empowerment? And then the second is, how do monetary remittances from labor migrants shape women's empowerment? This study is set in Kerala, which is a state in southern India. India was chosen for the study setting because it is the top migrant sending and remittance receiving country. It was also chosen because of the high dependence on remittance income. So prior to the pandemic, Kerala sent millions of migrants abroad and received billions of dollars in rupees, and over 30% of the country's GDP was from remittances, and I believe an even higher proportion was found in Kerala. So for some context, Kerala is a religiously diverse area with substantial Muslim, Christian, and Hindu populations. It has a relatively high life expectancy, which is over 10 years longer than other areas in India. Male literacy and female literacy is very high, both over 90%, which is also higher than the rest of the country. And the total fertility rate is about 1.8, which is lower than all other states in India. So here you can see that I've outlined Kerala and also the Gulf Cooperation Council countries where many men migrate from. So this migration flow has been occurring for over the past 50 years. Primarily young men under the age of 35 migrate from Kerala to the Persian or Arabian Gulf region, and then they remit money back to their families in Kerala. Most of these young men migrate on short-term work visas, and they often work on construction projects or industrialization projects. Just one example is many of them work on constructing the FIFA World Cup Stadium. And so the Gulf countries really encouraged the labor migration to work on these projects, but they also implemented policies that prevent migrants from permanently relocating in the area. Depending on the country, they often cannot remain there without a job. They have very few rights. There's no guarantee of health or housing, and in many cases, they can be deported at any time. So all of these factors together contribute to the circular migration of individuals migrating from Kerala to the Gulf region and then back, and only migrating for a few years at a time. This study uses survey data collected from the Kerala Migration Survey. The survey began in 1998 and collects data every few years, and its aim is to collect data on the scope of migration, remittances, and their effects. It's collected at both the individual and household level. And in the 2018 wave of the survey, there were over 60,000 individuals who were surveyed. The KMS uses a sampling strategy that aims to be representative of the state of Kerala. And this particular analysis, although they also collect panel data, this is a cross-sectional analysis of the 2018 data. In addition to collecting household and household data on the scope of migration and remittances, one of the modules that are included in the survey is a gender module. And that gender module was only asked to women who were aged 18 to 49. And these women are both in migrant and non-migrant households. The gender module is where the questions of empowerment were asked. So for that reason, this analysis was restricted to women who completed the gender module, and the sample of those women was just over 2,700. It should also be noted that the women are any women who were in migrant households, so it doesn't necessarily reflect a particular relationship to a migrant. So these women could either be spouses of migrants, mothers or daughters of migrants as well. The explanatory variables in this analysis were household migration status and amount of remittances. So based on household rosters, I created a dichotomous variable to reflect whether each household had a migrant abroad or not. And the survey asked questions about the amount of remittances received. So I was able to calculate the amount of money that households received in the form of remittances in the 12 months preceding the survey. I logged to transform the remittance variable in order to ease interpretation of the results as the association per doubling of the amount of remittances. For my outcome variables, I looked at empowerment indicators. So the survey asked many questions about women's empowerment. In fact, there were 44 questions that aimed to measure women's empowerment. And these questions were selected and validated by researchers in Kerala that have been used in other surveys in Kerala as well. So I used factor analysis in order to reduce the dimensionality of the data. So the factor analysis was able to allow me to reduce the 44 questions into underlying factors that represent empowerment. And I'll speak more about that in just a moment. So the factor analysis did two things. It allowed me to identify the number of factors or underlying categories that made up empowerment using this data-driven approach. And it also allowed me to determine which survey questions composed each factor. So after the factor analysis, these were the questions that were determined to continue to be used in the analysis. So they asked questions such as the ones that are on the screen, asking who usually makes decisions about how money will be used, about healthcare, about daily household needs. It asked women about their freedom of mobility to go to various places, And you could also see the response options on the screen. Women were also asked questions about household income, about who controls it, and what are women's specific sources of income. And it also asked for women to reply to questions about their comfort giving their opinions and others. And I'm happy to show these again if people have questions in the following the presentation. So as I mentioned, the factor analysis was used to reduce the dimensionality of the data. It reduced the 44 questions into 6 different factors. And after looking at the questions that composed each factor, I labeled them as household decision-making, freedom of movement, income control, expression of opinions, reproductive decision-making, and spousal attitudes. So then these 6 outcome variables, these became my 6 outcome variables. And based on the survey responses, I created scores for each of these 6 different dimensions. And I rescaled the scores so that they were each between 0 and 100. And these were used as the outcome variables in my regression analysis.
Can I ask a question, Sharon?
Yeah.
So something like income control, there would be multiple questions that would contribute to this thing called income control?
Yeah, so you can see here both of these questions, who controls household income and what are your sources, were both used to create that score.
And then you decided which questions matched with which concept, or did the factor analysis do that?
The factor analysis grouped these 2 together, and then I came up with the label for the construct.
Thank you.
And so then I used linear regression to estimate the effects of migration on the 6 different empowerment scores. And then I used 2-step Heckman selection models to estimate the effects of remittances on each of these 6 empowerment outcome scores. So here are some descriptive statistics for the sample. And as you can see, migrant and non-migrant households were similar in many ways. They have similar age distributions, but women in migrant households had slightly more education. And you can see here that the sample was religiously diverse with substantial Christian, Hindu, and Muslim populations. And then here is a continuation of the descriptive statistics. And in addition to showing you this information to get a sense of the population, I'm also showing this to show you the different covariates that I used in the model. So as you saw in the previous slide, I included age, education, marital status, and here you can see household structure and social context. And here, household structure was reflected whether women lived in nuclear families or whether they lived with parents, in-laws, or others. And social context was another variable that I constructed that reflected whether the woman's own religion was aligned with the religious plurality in her local geographic context.
I have a question, Sharon.
Yeah.
This is Magali. So you have lives in nuclear family or live with parents, in-laws, or others. Is it the habit that when the husband goes away, the woman moves in with her parents and then her husband comes back and then she moves in back with him in a nuclear setting? Or is it something more stable?
So I think it's more stable than that. But I mean, you can see that there are clear differences here, where here it's a pretty even split, and then here there are a higher proportion of parent lives with parents, in-laws, or others. But I don't believe that it's common that if the migrant leaves, then they go to live with their parents, in-laws, or others. But that is a good point. So thank you for asking. And so both of these variables were included in the models because we expect them to influence migration and empowerment. So it could be that, Magali, to answer your question, that household structure I think is more likely to shape whether an individual migrates or not.
Okay. So wait. Are you saying that individuals are more likely to migrate? I mean, men are more likely to migrate if they have parents or in-laws in the household, so there is support system for their wife? Is that what you're saying?
You know, I remember looking into this a while ago, but I think I would need to check back to where I've read and spoken to people about this in order to. I think I'll have to come back to you on this question.
Okay, no worries.
Okay, so this figure here presents the findings from my linear regression models. And so here, these are 6 different models, and these are, again, the 6 different outcomes, the 6 dimensions of empowerment. And so these models regressed the empowerment dimension score on whether or not the household had a migrant. And again, these are all adjusted models. So the figure here shows that living in a migrant household was positively associated with higher scores across several empowerment dimensions compared to households without migrants. And specifically, they show the strongest relationships between having a migrant and income control, and then a slightly weaker relationship for decision-making and freedom of movement. And because these scores are out of 100 percentage points, the models show that women in migrant households tended to report 20 percentage points more control over income than women in non-migrant households. They also show that women in migrant households tended to participate 12 percentage points more in household decision-making and 7 percentage points more in freedom of movement than women in non-migrant households. And then we see here that the effects are much smaller on the remaining 3 dimensions of empowerment, and that expression of opinion and spousal attitudes are not statistically significant.
Could you give us a sense of like what a spousal attitudes question would be?
Yeah, let me just go back to here. So, this would be an example of one. My spouse seeks out my opinion for decisions that we make together. So that would be reflecting the woman's perception of her spouse's thoughts on her opinions.
And when I look at that question, I think, well, maybe they're not making decisions together. Maybe she's on her own.
Yeah, if you want, I have an additional slide that shows exactly how I scored each of these questions. So I could show you how it broke down that, if that would be helpful to see.
You can do that much later. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so this figure shows the Heckman-corrected models that estimate the effects of remittances on each of these empowerment outcomes. So again, these are different models, and these look at the relationship between the amount of remittances and the different empowerment scores. And these models regress, the dimension score on the log of the amount of money that households received. And again, these are all adjusted models. And so here you can see that there is a similar pattern with these 3 dimensions finding positive and statistically significant results. And with these, we don't really see much or any of a signal. And so just as a reminder, because the explanatory variable here is the binary logarithm of the amount of remittances received. So we can interpret this as for every doubling of the amount of remittances received, is estimated to increase women's income control score by about 3 percentage points, women's freedom of movement score by nearly 2 percentage points, and women's decision-making by about 1 percentage point. And yes, again, here we see much smaller and not much effect on these 3 dimensions. So as I mentioned earlier, empowerment has been defined and measured in many different ways. And although there is a robust literature of rigorous research, previous measures were limited in several different ways. Many studies that measured empowerment used universal indicators, meaning that they used the same questions to measure empowerment in different settings. So this, of course, has the benefit of being able to compare empowerment scores in different places, but the downside to this is that it may not adequately represent the characteristics that define empowerment in different settings. In order to thoroughly understand empowerment, the questions might vary by setting. Similarly, many empowerment measures only they only looked at limited dimensions of empowerment. So there were studies that only looked at women's decision-making, participation, and freedom of movement. And so those might mask, using only those indicators could mask components that are really important to understanding empowerment and the factors that shape empowerment. And then other studies still used some scores as a measure of overall empowerment. And a limitation of that is that it might assume linear trajectories from less to more empowered and might mask different relationships and how things influence empowerment. So this study improves upon the measurement of empowerment in a couple different ways. It uses local conceptualizations of empowerment, which, as I said earlier, the questions were tested and used by researchers on the ground in Kerala. And it also allows for the examination of multifaceted relationships between migration, remittances, and empowerment, because as I described, I used the 6 different dimensions of empowerment, and we were able to see different dimensions, different effects between the different dimensions. And so these findings are important because they highlight how migration shapes the lives of women around the world, but particularly in Kerala. And they also have important implications because many studies have shown how certain dimensions of empowerment might influence health in many different ways. So to take a step back, hundreds of millions of migrants have been sending billions of dollars in remittances to their sending countries. So this particular study illuminates how these processes influence the empowerment of women in transnational families. The results show that in Kerala, empowerment encompasses multiple components. As we saw earlier, these include decision-making, freedom of movement, income control, expression of opinion, reproductive decision-making, and spousal attitudes. And we saw that there were different relationships between migration and remittances and the different outcomes. So we saw that remittances and migration were positively and strongly correlated with decision-making, income control, and freedom of movement. And when we consider what those 3 categories have in common is that they could reflect women's activities. So residing in a migrant household seems to have been correlated with increased responsibilities, like making more decisions and having more control over income. Increased freedom of mobility might reflect a couple different things. It might suggest that women are able to travel to additional places in order to perform household responsibilities, but it might also mean that they're traveling more for recreation or visiting family. We didn't see a strong relationship between migration and expression of opinion, reproductive decision-making, and spousal attitudes. So this suggests what those 3 factors have in common might suggest that there isn't a meaningful effect on women's social status. So in other words, while women in migrant households may have taken on more responsibilities, their social status appears to be not changing nearly as much. And so although these results suggest that migration and remittances can have important and positive effects on women, at least as measured by these 3 dimensions, it's still important to keep the other dimensions in mind, as well as other dimensions of women's well-being that are not included in the empowerment measures. So although women might take on more responsibilities, they still, in Kerala, face high risk of domestic violence and suicide, and those, of course, are not incorporated in these measures of empowerment. So these findings show that migration of men has important implications on the lives of women left behind, often hundreds of miles away from their migrant family members. And it also shows that the way that we conceptualize and that we measure complex constructs, such as empowerment, are important. So some future directions for this research would be to use the panel data from the KMS and from other data sets in different settings to examine longer relationships over longer periods of time, to adopt a life course perspective to examine how migration and remittances might vary, their effects might vary by stage of life, to look at how empowerment might shape the relationships between migration and health, and also to explore relationships between empowerment and other health outcomes that affect older populations, such as dementia risk and outcomes. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to talk more about this and hear any suggestions that you might have to build on this research.
Thank you, Sharon. That was really wonderful.
Thank you.
So we have quite a few questions. I think Magali has her hand raised, so I'll just start with Magali. Magali, do you want to just unmute and ask?
Sure. Thank you very much. Sharon, can you go back to your first conclusion slide, please? No, next slide. Next. It's towards the end. It says conclusion.
Oh, wait, sorry, go to my conclusion slide?
Yes, this one. Okay. So I have a first question and then a follow-up. So my first question is, do I understand properly that your explanatory variables are these 6 factors, but you're not controlling specifically independently for education or religion or other individual characteristics of either the husband or the wife? Is that correct?
Right. I am only the models are just adjusted for the education and the religion of the respondent.
Oh, okay. So you do control for that, because my question was, here you say women in migrant households took on more responsibilities. So you're suggesting that that they took more responsibilities while their husbands are away. But I was wondering if there could be some kind of reverse causality here, where the households where the man is more likely to migrate are those with, we know that migrants typically have higher levels of education than non-migrants. So that would suggest their wife due to, because of matchmaking, which suggests that maybe the women had more responsibilities or higher decision-making power independently from the migration before the husband migrated. And same thing for religion. I noticed that Hindu are more likely to migrate than Muslims, for instance. And we know that women's position in Hindu households are, they have more decision-making power again than in Muslim households, for instance. So I was wondering how you deal with all of that. And if you have these coefficients in your regression, do you have like interaction terms that would let you see whether they are differentially impacted by education or religious status? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for raising those points. I think those are all very important. So I think reverse causality is certainly a limitation here, and it is possible. I would also say that in a follow-up analysis as a sort of sensitivity analysis, I did actually use the panel data to look at this analysis with a few of the outcome variables, and I actually did see the same finding with women's participation in decision making. So that allowed me, so I did fixed effects models in order to use each woman as a control for herself. And I did still see the same relationship, but looking at this analysis on its own, I would agree that reverse causality is certainly a possibility. And if you have additional ideas for which interaction terms which might be useful to include in the models, I'm still working on this analysis and would be happy to see how it affects the results.
Okay, we can talk about it later.
All right, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the chat, and folks, you can also raise your hands if that's easier. Michelle, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Sharon. This is great. Thank you so much. I'm curious if you would be willing to go back to your slide where you show the measures of empowerment. Okay, great. Yeah, I was curious about whether some of the response options included a situation where the respondent and the husband can decide jointly. But what about on the income measure?
Yeah, so these were just asking about if the woman has her own source of income, and this question did not allow for multiple people to respond. to participate in controlling the income.
Yeah, or I mean, I don't know this context very well, but I'm curious, like, you know, to the extent to which they're non-migrant households, are women and men, how much are they deciding together on controlling income? And just to think about a measurement issue, and if that's not available in your survey data, I mean, think about this for all of your response categories, like how might that bias results, or just kind of think about that a little more carefully moving this forward.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I appreciate you raising it. It's something that I thought a little bit about, especially when I was talking to people about how best to score these questions, for example. So the decision making based on how people respond in Kerala, I actually gave women credit for, not credit, but they received a point if they either responded alone or with their husbands, whereas with the freedom to travel, they only got a more empowered score if they traveled alone. So yeah, that was something that I was considering and how to score these as well. So I appreciate you asking about it.
Okay, great.
Okay, so see one more person has their hand raised. Lakshmi, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Great presentation, Sharon, and I would be happy to connect with you because this is an area of interest for me, and I'm doing one of my dissertation papers on women's empowerment.
Okay.
So I have read some literature, and this is more of a conceptual question, is if women's empowerment is indeed the process of gaining control, right? What do you think of studying it using cross-sectional data, right? Because we're not able to look at the changes in empowerment when their husbands transition migrants abroad. And the second question I had, or actually second is more of a consideration for you, is if you wanted to look at whether the association between remittances and empowerment changes by the type of household, because there's a lot of literature from South Asia that suggests that women living with in-laws have more curtailed freedom of movement and decision making. So wondering if you would like to look at that interaction, and I think you are seeking suggestions. So that's, I think, one of the things you may want to consider in your future analysis.
Yes, thank you. So for your first, I'm excited to hear that you're working on a similar topic as well. And so I definitely take your point very seriously about if you can measure a process of change with cross-sectional data. And so I think that that also comes back to this issue of how empowerment is measured and conceptualized and defined and measured by many different people in many different ways. So while a lot of the definitions of empowerment do involve this change, some of them, I think use definitions that allow to be measured at a single point in time, but also the process of empowerment, even with longitudinal or panel data, it's not always a quick transition from being less empowered to more empowered in multiple dimensions, and can change in many different ways. And so I think just overall there are a lot of measurement challenges to trying to measure a construct like this. And so I think there are most of the studies on empowerment actually do use cross-sectional data, and you can say that that is a limitation of a lot of research in this area, but it's also the way that we can at least talk about these processes now is measuring with the with the survey questions that are available.
Yeah, that's great. And sorry, I'm just taking up additional time, but one of the other things to consider is women in Kerala are generally more literate than other parts of the country, and also they and we know that education is highly correlated with empowerment. So I think one of the other things is you might want to study whether this association still holds by the level of education that women have in your sample. I think that's the other thing to also sort of assess as a modifier.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Maria, do you want to ask your question?
This is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering whether some of these empowerment questions, the answer would change when the spouse is home versus in migration. And so that makes me think that it's like, well, how much of the income control would be retained once the spouse is back? In Mexico, there was some research done on how the return of the migrant spouse then created this accentuated power dynamic while they were home. And so any benefits of empowerment while they were gone, regressed when they were home, because it was a shorter period of time and they bring money. And so maybe some of the responses would be a little bit different while they are home. And I was also wondering whether, whether having greater income while the spouse is sending money, whether that also in itself just creates more choices versus having to spend, not having the choice of spending money on other things because there's just simply no money. So the greater amount of income also maybe would afford someone more choices in decision making just by itself.
Yeah, I think that's a good point and very probable. I mean, and as we've seen, the remittances were associated with, participation in more decision making and, freedom of mobility to different places. So I think that we did see that it was correlated at least with more choices, and it seems like the remittance income, seems like it was a factor in that. And I think your first question or your first point was also important, and it's been something that I've thought would be an interesting next question, would be to look at what happens when the men return home. I know that there has been research on this, especially when men come home from war. And so I think that would be a similar sort of question to ask, building on the same idea. And so it's not something that I have examined yet, but I think your point is right, that it would be interesting to see if the benefits continue or how they change when the migrants return home. Thank you.
Josh?
So maybe just following up on this, when the migrants return home, I guess I would expect something like this to have relatively, in the scheme of women's empowerment through history and across space, I would expect that migration would have a relatively small effect. Something like World War II, when the men left and then came back, was followed by a very conservative gender time after World War II. Kind of, you go back to where you started, and I was kind of thinking why that is. I guess part of it is that in a household, it takes more than one person to change the situation. So you have kind of, if the husband doesn't change at all, then maybe when the husband returns, you get back to where you started. So I guess my question is twofold. Are there examples kind of in world history where we see big gender-specific migrations transforming gender roles or transforming women's empowerment? That's kind of a general question. And then my second question is, do you have any plans to study what happens to men's attitudes, or, for example, when you do this longitudinal study, how you're going to try to do this from two directions?
Yes, thank you. Those are two great questions. The first one is, I think I would need to look more into the literature on that. Nothing is jumping out at me right now as examples of how migration transforms gender roles, but I'm sure I know more about it. I just need to think a little bit more on it. And plans to study men's attitudes is something that I would like to do, but I don't think I can do with this particular data set. I mean, these questions were only asked to the women in the gender module. They weren't asked in the broader Kerala migration survey data. So it's possible that in other settings and different surveys, there might be more information on this, but currently all the waves of the Kerala migration survey don't ask these sorts of questions to men. So that's certainly a limitation here, in that all of these questions do come from the perspective of women.
Yeah, we're getting an interesting comment from Lisa Dillon on my World War II thing, and that is that maybe this happens more gradually. If I think about, say, my grandparents, who this happened to, maybe the real effect was for my parents, in which they saw that their mother was able to be alone and function without their father, and that made the marriage may have returned to where it was when the father came back, but then the children had a new example. So maybe this is part of some, even though it may not change within the household, it's part of some kind of a seed to much broader change over longer periods of time.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for commenting on that.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end of time, but I'm gonna sneak in one question that I had. So when you're thinking about these measures of empowerment, Sharon, that you've constructed these 6 dimensions, do you have a sense of either from your own work or just the literature of which of these empowerment measures are more or less correlated with, sort of measures of health and well-being for the women themselves? So essentially, which of these empowerment measures should we care about the most? And the one interesting thing I think would be to think about this from a sort of long-term historical perspective is how you could probably look at this with the panel data. How are each of these measures changing over time? Are some dimensions of empowerment stagnant while others are not? And are there variations based on household characteristics or something like that? But essentially, what should we care most about if we're interested in sort of if our ultimate goal is the well-being of women?
Yeah, that's a great question, and really, gets at the significance of this type of work. So there has been a really large body of literature that looks at the relationships between empowerment and different health outcomes. And some studies looked at certain dimensions of health, certain dimensions of empowerment and certain dimensions of health, and others looked at these sum scores. And so one thing that I was saying before was that the literature is actually quite complicated on that. But I think there are studies that I should probably reread more recently, having these findings in mind, thinking about which are the specific ones that are most important for different dimensions of health. But I can imagine that, women making more, if one of the pathways through which empowerment shapes health is through, have it leading to higher utilization of healthcare, it seems like, decision making around when to see a doctor or how money is spent on, if it should be spent on healthcare, those are things that seem to that's a pathway through which empowerment can shape health. So I think to really answer your question, I should look back at those studies that looked at the specific relationships and see how exactly those studies measured empowerment. But I have to admit, I did that literature review a while ago.
There's a comment from Lakshmi also that we should care about women's empowerment as an end goal in itself, right, and not necessarily whether it's related to other outcomes.
Yeah, it's important in itself. Thank you for saying that.
Lisa, did you have a question? Just a comment? Okay. Josh has another question. Josh, you have your hand raised still?
That's just,
or maybe that's a previous.
Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks, Sharon. Really enjoyed it.
Any other final thoughts or comments before we end? All right. Well, thank you so much, Sharon. That was really wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. And we'll be back next week. Thanks, Sharon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks.